Hi everyone, welcome to the Mindful Living Podcast. My name is Stephanie Robilio and I'm your host. Here we will have real conversations about what it takes to achieve optimal wellness in mind, body, and spirit. It's one thing to know and it's entirely different to know how. As they say, applied knowledge is power, and on each episode I will teach you how to apply the things you are learning so that you can create the change you seek, heal, recover, and be well now. In case you're wondering, I'm a licensed clinical social worker and the clinical director for Agape Behavioral Healthcare. Fun fact, I'm also a published author. I write poetry and self-help workbooks, which you can find on Amazon or my website. If you are ready to move out of your own way and step into your power, you have landed at the right place. Keep listening and let's do this. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Mindful Living Podcast. As always, I am so grateful to be here today, having this space to jump on and record a quick podcast for you. Today I feel led to talk about boundaries. I think that this is a conversation that's always important, but as we get closer to the end of this year, for me personally, I always feel like it's a really good time to check in with ourselves and have an honest conversation about what are we working towards, and are we staying on track with what's best for our overall health and wellness? And I believe strongly that boundaries are the key to achieving overall health and wellness. And not just overall health and wellness, but optimal health and wellness. We can't really get there if we're lacking boundaries. But here's the thing, most of us, if we're honest with each other, boundaries can be very, very difficult to hold. While sure, most people have an idea of what boundaries are, and they seem to have an idea of where they need to have boundaries. But again, the knowing is one thing and the knowing how is entirely different. And from not only my professional experience, but also my personal experience in my own life, something that I've noticed is when it comes to having to apply the boundaries we know we need, that's the really tricky part. And it's tricky for a lot of reasons. But today, I'm not going to dive too deep. I'm just going to kind of share information with you guys with hopes that it brings some insight into your own boundary style. And then we're going to get into the ultimate goal, which is really working towards having healthy boundaries. And how do we do that? So first, I want to start off just by sharing, most people seem to know what physical boundaries are. And what I mean by that is, let's use the example of when we see a stop sign. We know that that means stop. When we see a green light, we know that that means go. A yellow light, slow down. We also know if we are driving towards an area or walking towards an area, and if there's an area that's blocked off by a gate, we know that's an indicator of don't cross this area. It means stop, right? It's blocked off for a reason. The gate is the physical boundary. But what happens is when it comes to understanding personal boundaries that support our emotional and mental health and even our spiritual health, we tend to really struggle with getting clear on what does that mean. And really it comes down to something as simple as the fact that we never learned this, right? Unless you ended up in treatment, therapy, or you happen to pick up a self-help book or one of my workbooks, you probably wouldn't really know what personal boundaries are because we didn't learn this in school. We learned physical boundaries, right? Everybody was taught what red light, green light, and yellow light mean. We were taught what a stop sign means. We were taught, if there's a caution, wet floor sign, we knew that that meant slow down. Like these are things that we've been taught, but nobody ever taught us what it means to really protect our inner peace and our energy and our progress in life. And so there's two main boundaries that people typically struggle with. We have rigid boundaries and porous boundaries. People with rigid boundaries, these are the individuals who struggle with intimacy and close relationships. They have a hard time asking for help. In general, they tend to have very few close relationships, and they tend to protect their personal information, meaning they don't share much about their life or what's going on. And in some cases, they may even seem detached from themselves and from others, especially in romantic relationships. And they tend to just, in general, keep people at a distance. And the reason for this is there's a fear of rejection. They also tend to be the person who, they're stuck to a schedule, they're following a tight schedule, and if something or someone asks them to kind of wiggle in their schedule, they might have a strong emotional reaction because they're rigid, right? They're just kind of staying in the box that they know. And, I want to highlight whether a person has rigid boundaries or porous boundaries, which we'll get into. It's remembering that boundaries are what keep us safe. And so for the person who's still stuck in a rigid boundary, for whatever reason, they're still finding safety in their rigidness. Whereas somebody who struggles with porous boundaries, these are the opposite. It's the complete opposite of rigid in some regard, because the porous boundary is the person who's oversharing information. This is the person who you just meet and they start telling you all kinds of personal information that you didn't ask for, and maybe it's not even appropriate for you to know. These individuals have a hard time saying no to others. They're the yesers, right? The people pleasers. They also tend to be overly involved with other people's problems, and they tend to rely or depend on the opinions of others. And this individual who has porous boundaries, they tend to allow the abuse or disrespect of others. And what's interesting is they share the rooted fear of rejection, just like the person of a rigid boundary. At the bottom of all of this, there's a fear of being rejected. So the difference is rigid is, I have a fear of being rejected, so I'm going to keep you far away. Whereas porous is, I have a fear of being rejected, so I'm going to overshare and get overly involved with the belief that that's going to keep you close. But here's the thing, neither really work, right? They might have worked at one point in a person's life, but if you've been connected with me and you whether it's in real life or on social media or through my workbooks or the podcast, then you often hear me talk about how we learn boundaries through our early childhood experiences, or through the things that happened for us, or through the things that didn't happen for us. And every single behavior that we've learned at one point in our life kept us safe on an emotional level. It served us greatly. But here's what happens is we reach a point in our life with what used to keep us safe no longer does. It actually becomes the barrier that blocks us from being able to live more authentically, reach our goals, and just feel free of the weight that comes with being stuck in a rigid boundary or a porous boundary. And a life without boundaries ultimately will lead to not feeling good. There's really no other way around it, because eventually it's like weight that just gets stuck to you, and we can only carry so much emotional weight before we start to feel run down. And in some cases, it can even lead to having resentment towards self and others. And then the goal, right, is to be working towards healthy boundaries, or what some would call flexible boundaries. And a person who has healthy boundaries, these are people who are in touch with their true self. They're living aligned with their true self. They're doing the day-to-day work that it takes to stay on track with what's best for them. These are people who clearly know their own values, and also know that we don't always have to share values as humans, right? Whether it's parents, children, partners, husbands, wives, coworkers, friends, it's completely okay to have different values. People with healthy boundaries also have the ability to say no without overly explaining themselves, or saying no without feeling guilty for it. They also know that what a person says or does has nothing to do with them. And these individuals also are very clear about their personal wants and needs, and they're able to communicate them. But it's also really important for all of us to just be mindful that just because a person might have healthy boundaries doesn't mean they're forever in a place of healthy, right? It's very, very common for us as individuals to sometimes fall back into old ways. And so a lot of times what you'll see happen is, for example, a person will have excellent, healthy, flexible boundaries in the workplace, but in their personal life, they really struggle with boundaries. Maybe they're being really rigid, or they're porous. Or it could be vice versa, where in their personal life, it might be easier to have healthy boundaries, but in the workplace, maybe they struggle with porous boundaries, where they're just saying yes to everyone and everything out of fear of being rejected. And so it's important to know that it is normal to have a mix of different boundary types. The same thing is true for relationships. Maybe people are really great at having boundaries with friendships, but when it comes to romantic relationships, there's a struggle with boundaries. And so, I think the most important way to get started with getting clear on how to have boundaries is starting by, one, affirming and knowing that you as your own person, you are important. Your mental health is important, your emotional health, your physical health, your spiritual health, your overall life is important. And when we truly believe we are important, then we tend to take action that is aligned with keeping ourselves feeling good from start to finish. But it's also important to know that getting clear on what's important to you, right, as far as your values, that can help guide asserting and holding boundaries. Because think about it, if you know what's important to you, then it's going to make it easier to have the boundary. Whereas if you don't know what's important to you, then you could see how you could easily get stuck in poor boundaries. But really, even though it can seem hard, it can be simple. And the reason I think it can be simple is if you just are staying in one day at a time and making decisions that are best for you one moment at a time, then with consistent practice of doing that, inevitably it'll lead to healthy boundaries. The reason I think people get so hung up with boundaries is oftentimes we're trying to predict what's to come. We're always worried about what's next. How will I this? How will I that? How will I tell my mom I can't be there for this event? Or how will I tell my partner, no, I don't want to do that? Or how will I tell my employee, no, I can't cover their shift? Whatever the story might be for you. Whereas if you're only focusing on one day at a time, most of us, and most often, we tend to have exactly what it takes to get through a day while maintaining boundaries. We just seem to have a hard time when we're trying to control the future, or if we're stuck on something that happened in the past. And again, those of you who know me know that I often say we cannot do anything about our past. It's literally impossible to change it. We also can't necessarily predict everything that's going to happen in the future. But one thing that we are absolutely capable of is learning how to practice being present, learning how to respond to people, places, and things in our overall external environment. And we do this by just practicing pausing. Just pause. So if you're a person who struggles with boundaries, I would suggest a good way to start is just by pausing. Oftentimes we feel like we have to respond so quickly to the outside world. But the truth is we get to decide who and what we respond to and how quickly we respond. We are allowed to move at a pace that feels good to us. We are allowed to slow down. We do not have to respond right away. And what I have found, even in my own life, is when I give myself that pause moment in between thought and action, I set myself up for success for no other reason other than because I paused, I prevented myself from just responding automatically. And that's where most of us get hung up because we're moving so fast, we're on autopilot, and then we just automatically respond to people. And then because of that, our boundaries tend to be poor. Whereas if you're giving yourself the space to pause, think about what's best for you, think about what you most need in that moment, then from there, respond. By doing so, you will better be able to hold your boundaries. And I've said this before, and I'm going to say it again. Every single one of us, we are so worthy and deserving of feeling good. But our ability to feel good is 100% up to us. There is no person, no place, or no thing outside of us that can make ourselves feel whole. While sure, are we influenced by the outside world? Does our environment matter? Yes, of course. Of course it does. But our inner world is so important. And we are the only people who can create a beautiful inner world. And our boundaries are our responsibility. It is no one else's responsibility to say no for you. It is no one else's responsibility to make better choices for you, no matter what the choices are. If it's choosing a new job because you feel burnt out, if it's changing your eating habits because you're not feeling well, if it's working on your depressed mood or your anxious state, like all of this is up to you. If it's taking that leap of faith into that goal that you've been thinking of or that dream that you've been visualizing, if it's leaving the unhealthy relationship, if it's setting boundaries with your loved ones, your friends, your families, if it's no longer spending hours on social media, like whatever your individual story is, you are the only person who can hold the boundary you need so that you can not only feel good, but truly move forward in your life and thrive. All of us are capable of thriving. But if we don't become aware of where we need to improve our boundaries, then inevitably we will stay on autopilot. And when we are on autopilot, we tend to be stuck in survival. So here is becoming aware and doing the day-to-day consistent work that it takes to break free from survival so that we can get closer to thriving, because we are all worthy and deserving of that. I love you all so much. Until the next episode. Thank you for joining me today. If you found today's episode to be insightful and inspiring, subscribe so you don't miss out on the next one. And I kindly ask that you please leave me a review so together we can help the next person. To learn more about my products and services, check out www.themindfulliving.com and come connect with me on Instagram at mindfulliving.now, where I share daily inspiration, mindful skills, tips, and more. Until the next episode, stay mindful and always remember the power that lives inside of you.